Now, we're heading into the palaces of the Han Dynasty, China, more than 2,000 years ago. A dynasty that gave its name to an entire people. A dynasty that lasted 4 centuries. And a dynasty where the fate of emperors often rested not in the hands of noble ministers or warrior families, but in the quiet grip of palace eunuchs. Eunuchs, in case you need the refresher, were men who'd undergone a certain, irreversible surgery. The idea was simple: remove the possibility of fathering children, and you remove the temptation of setting up your own dynasty. The emperor could keep them close, confident that they wouldn't turn around and try to found Eunuch Family Incorporated. On paper, they were safe, loyal, dependable. In reality, they became some of the most powerful and feared figures in Chinese history. Because when you take away family ambition, you don't erase ambition entirely. You just concentrate it in one direction. And that direction was always the emperor himself. At first, eunuchs had simple jobs. Serving in the inner palace, carrying food, guarding the imperial women, fussing over details like curtains and candles. Menial work. Nothing to worry about. But here's the trick: proximity. Ministers and generals only saw the emperor in formal settings, with layers of ceremony. Eunuchs were there all the time, bringing food, delivering documents, tucking the emperor into bed. If you control the doors to power, you control power itself. Now imagine being a child emperor. It happened more often than you'd think. A kid of 8 or 9 suddenly declared son of heaven, shoved onto the throne with a crown too big for his head. Relatives scheming. Ministers barking orders. Generals salivating at the chance to protect the throne, usually code for run things ourselves. Who does that child turn to? Not the scary old officials quoting Confucius. Not the relatives plotting behind curtains. He turns to the men who've been raising him. The eunuchs. And so the bond formed. Young emperors grew up trusting eunuchs as caretakers, confidants, sometimes even as substitute fathers. That bond lasted into adulthood. And with it came power. Power the ministers despised, but couldn't dislodge. By the Eastern Han period, eunuchs weren't just servants. They were kingmakers. They blocked rival factions, whispered in the emperor's ear, and, when necessary, arranged for inconvenient enemies to suffer very sudden illnesses. They controlled the gate to the throne. No audience unless they allowed it. No decree unless they delivered it. Ministers could shout, generals could march, but if the eunuch said no, nothing happened. Naturally, the Confucian scholar officials hated this with the burning passion of 1,000 candles. They were supposed to be the moral guardians of the dynasty, armed with classics and ritual. And now they had to beg favors from low-born eunuchs who, in their view, were little more than mutilated servants. Imagine a Harvard graduate forced to grovel before a janitor, except the janitor can decide if your family lives or dies. That was the vibe. And the eunuchs did not exactly help their image. They took bribes. They sold government offices like they were running a Black Friday sale. They promoted their friends and demoted their enemies. A clique known as the 10 Attendants became infamous in the late Han, supposedly a cabal of 10 eunuchs who ran the court like their personal fiefdom. Were there really only 10? Of course not. Ancient historians loved round numbers the way modern tabloids love exaggerations. But the label stuck, and so did the reputation for corruption. Purges followed. Ministers tried to slaughter eunuchs. Eunuchs persuaded emperors to slaughter ministers. Entire families were wiped out on whispered accusations. The palace must have felt like one long episode of Political Survivor, except no one was ever voted off the island gently. And yet, not every eunuch was corrupt. History remembers the villains because most of the records we have come from Confucian scholars, the eunuchs' sworn enemies. But some were genuinely loyal. They protected child emperors from grasping relatives. They worked tirelessly to keep the palace stable during crises. They acted as buffers between emperors and officials who wanted too much. Their names are harder to find, because quiet loyalty doesn't make for juicy history. But it existed. The irony is hard to miss. The entire system was designed to keep eunuchs powerless. Their condition was supposed to exclude them from dynastic politics. And precisely because of that, emperors trusted them. And precisely because emperors trusted them, they became the most powerful voices in the palace. A perfect example of how trying to outsmart human ambition usually just reroutes it. Of course, it all ended badly. By the late 2nd century CE, infighting between eunuchs and ministers had hollowed the empire. While they fought, peasants starved, corruption spread, and rebellions like the Yellow Turbans shook the land. Warlords rose, the Han Dynasty fractured, and eunuchs were massacred in the chaos. Palaces stormed, whispers silenced, the cycle reset. And yet, later dynasties brought them back. The Tang had their eunuchs. The Ming had theirs. One eunuch, Jing He, even commanded treasure fleets across oceans. The pattern repeated: rise, influence, resentment, purge, over and over again. So tonight, as you drift, picture the Han Palace. Lanterns glowing softly, curtains of silk swaying in the draft, ministers muttering in frustration outside the gates, and inside, a eunuch walking quietly down a polished corridor, carrying a scroll, pausing at the emperor's chamber, whispering advice. Not a king, not a general, but somehow, holding the empire in his hands. And with that, let's leave the palace behind and step into something a little more ordinary. Ordinary, but still very strange. Because in medieval Europe, the nights weren't smooth stretches of sleep like ours. They were broken in two, with a quiet interval in the middle. First sleep. Second sleep. The forgotten rhythm of the night. So, we've tiptoed out of the Han Palace, away from eunuchs whispering at chamber doors, and now we're stumbling into something far more relatable: sleep. Though, to be fair, medieval Europe managed to make even that weird. Because unlike us, with our tidy 8-hour blocks, they treated night as two separate shifts. First sleep, then a pause, then second sleep. It wasn't insomnia. It wasn't even considered unusual. It was just life. Everyone knew what first sleep meant, from peasants dozing in smoky huts to monks wrapped in itchy wool habits to nobles shivering in drafty castles. Picture it. You're a farmer in 14th century England. You've spent the day knee-deep in mud, dragging a plough behind a cow that clearly hates you, eating bread so dark it could double as a roof tile. Dinner is whatever stew you've managed to scrape together. Then the sun sets, the fire dies down, and candles are too expensive to waste. So, everyone just goes to bed. And bed doesn't mean four-poster elegance. It means a sack stuffed with straw, crawling with lice, and probably shared with your entire family. And maybe a chicken. Or the pig. Because yes, keeping livestock inside meant warmth. Nothing like the smell of manure to lull you into dreamland. You fall asleep quickly, because exhaustion trumps comfort. That's your first sleep. 4 hours later, you wake up. Not panicked. Not stressed. Just awake. And so is everybody else. This was the watch. That middle-of-the-night interlude where people prayed, poked at the fire, or whispered stories. Monks shuffled off to chant psalms, because nothing says holiness like dragging yourself into a freezing chapel at 2 a.m. Doctors even recommended this time as ideal for intimacy, because, apparently, being half asleep made it healthier and more virtuous. Medieval medicine is basically one long because I said so. Sometimes people just visited neighbors. Imagine it's 1:30 in the morning, you knock on the door with a candle stub in hand, and instead of calling the guards, your neighbor says, "Oh good, you're up too. Come in, let's complain about the miller again." That was normal. Night wasn't silent. It was just slower. Dreams, too, played their part. People remembered their dreams most vividly after first sleep, and they took them seriously. Whole manuals existed to decode them. Dream of falling? Bad omen. Dream of eating? Prosperity's coming. Dream of fish? Honestly, probably doom, because medieval people assumed everything was doom. And if you woke up paralyzed, unable to move, that was proof a demon, the mayor, had sat on your chest. Today we call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was just Wednesday night with Satan. Beds, meanwhile, reflected class as much as comfort. Peasants had their straw sacks. Nobles had wooden frames with curtains. Not for luxury, but to block drafts and, more importantly, to stop things from falling out of the rafters. Dust, bugs, the occasional rat. Canopy beds weren't invented for romance. They were pest control. Castles were worse. Giant stone refrigerators. Even with fires roaring, the air stayed freezing. So nobles piled on furs, servants huddled close for warmth, and still the royal nose turned blue. A king might sleep on embroidered cushions, but he was shivering just like the pig farmer. So, how did this rhythm vanish? Simple, light. As candles got cheaper and oil lamps improved, people stayed awake later. By the 17th and 18th centuries, bedtime shifted closer to midnight. There wasn't enough time for 2 sleeps anymore. By the 19th century, doctors were diagnosing segmented sleep as a disorder. Because, of course, Victorians couldn't resist labeling everything unhealthy: fainting spells, tight corsets, women reading novels. Why not add waking up at night to the list? Today, if you wake at 2 a.m., you stress. You reach for your phone, scroll through doom, and decide you're broken. But in the Middle Ages, you'd shrug, poke the embers, maybe whisper a prayer, and wait for second sleep to roll in. It wasn't failure. It was normal. And maybe that's the oddly comforting lesson here. If you find yourself awake in the dark hours, you're not malfunctioning. You're just medieval. You're living like your ancestors did for centuries. Sharing a quiet hour with farmers, monks, nobles, and yes, the pig in the corner. So the next time your eyes pop open in the middle of the night, don't panic. Breathe. Pretend you're waiting for matins in a monastery, or gossiping with a neighbor about grain prices. Second sleep will come. It always did. And with that, let's slip out of the smoky cottage, close the creaky shutters, and drift back further in time. To a shining city on the sea, where a colossal tower rose above the harbor. Flames blazing, mirrors flashing, guiding sailors home across dark waters. The Lighthouse of Alexandria. So, we've wandered out of smoky medieval bedrooms, past peasants scratching in straw and monks muttering in chapels, and now we're stepping onto the deck of an ancient ship. The waves are rolling, the stars are hiding behind clouds, and the coastline of Egypt is somewhere out there, filled with sandbanks, rocks, and every possible opportunity to sink your cargo of olives. And then, there it is. A light. Flickering above the horizon. A flame so high it almost looks like it's hanging in the sky. The Lighthouse of Alexandria. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and one of the very few wonders that was actually useful. The others? Mostly monuments to dead men with too much money. A giant tomb here, a massive temple there, a giant statue glaring down at you for reasons no one really remembers. But the lighthouse? It wasn't about ego. Okay, it was partly about ego. It's always about ego, but it was also about survival. Sailors adored it. Merchants depended on it. It was a wonder that actually earned its keep. It all started with Alexander the Great. Of course it did. The man couldn't pass a coastline without founding a city and naming it after himself. Alexandria became his most famous namesake, a bustling hub of trade where Greek ambition met Egyptian grain supplies. After Alexander inconveniently dropped dead at 32, proving that conquering half the known world is not great for your health, his general Ptolemy grabbed Egypt. And Ptolemy wanted his capital to be a showpiece. So, he ordered monuments. The library, where they stole every scroll they could get their hands on. And the lighthouse, built on a little island called Pharos. From then on, the very word Pharos became shorthand for lighthouse in half the world's languages. Imagine building something so famous it renames the entire category. Now, the numbers vary, because ancient writers loved exaggerating. Some said the lighthouse stood 300 feet tall. Others swore it was 400. Either way, it was enormous. A stone tower rising in 3 tiers, a square base, a cylindrical middle, and a smaller tower at the top. Like a wedding cake for giants. And perched on top of it all, the flame. This wasn't a cozy candle. It was a bonfire, roaring every night. Workers hauled wood and oil up spiral ramps wide enough for donkeys. Because, of course, if you're going to keep the world's biggest nightlight going, you don't do it alone. You get donkey labor. The eternal flame of the ancient world was probably powered by a very unimpressed donkey named Gerasimos. By day, polished bronze mirrors reflected sunlight across the sea. By night, they magnified the fire. Sailors could see it from more than 30 miles away, which, when you're navigating with stars, waves, and desperate prayer, was basically like someone installing a neon sign saying, "This way to safety." Naturally, myths followed. Some said the mirrors could focus the light into a burning beam, setting enemy ships ablaze. Which sounds spectacular and very cinematic, and also completely impossible. Bronze mirrors are shiny, but they're not laser cannons. At best, you'd annoy a captain by flashing light in his eyes. But still, people loved the story, because who doesn't want a wonder of the world to double as a death ray? For centuries, the lighthouse did its job. Travelers described it in glowing terms, usually exaggerating how bright or how tall it was. Ancient writers were basically the Yelp reviewers of their time. 5 stars, visible from 100 miles away, would sail again. It became a symbol of Alexandria itself, along with the library. The city wasn't just a port. It was the port. But of course, nothing that big lasts forever. Earthquakes rocked the Egyptian coast again and again.
In 956, in 1303, in 1323.
Each one chipped away at the lighthouse until, finally, it crumbled. By the time Europeans arrived centuries later, it was gone. Not even a ruin, just recycled stone, repurposed into fortresses. The Pharos had gone from wonder to rubble to construction material. A depressing end, but also a very practical one. Still, not everything vanished. In the 20th century, divers found the fallen stones lying on the seabed of Alexandria's harbor. Huge blocks, carvings, fragments of the once great tower. Some were even raised and put in museums. The lighthouse may be gone from the skyline, but it lingers under the waves, waiting. And maybe that's why it feels different from the other wonders. It wasn't a temple to a god or a tomb for a king. It was a gift to sailors. A massive, burning promise, "We'll guide you home." Sure, it was also a flex by the Ptolemies, because rulers can't resist flexing. But at its heart, it was a monument to something practical. A wonder with a purpose. Picture it one last time, the sea rough and dark, sailors exhausted, and then a glow in the distance. Relief spreading across the deck. A city waiting, safe harbor ahead. That's what the lighthouse stood for. Hope, safety, a light in the dark. And with that, we'll leave the waves behind and drift inland again. Back to a different kind of hoard, one not of light but of clay. A king who collected more books than anyone else in the ancient world. A library filled with omens, medical recipes, and epic poetry, all scratched into mud. Ashurbanipal's Library of Nineveh. So, we've drifted past whispering eunuchs in China, broken medieval dreams in smoky cottages, and a colossal lighthouse blazing over the sea. For our last wander tonight, let's go back even further. To Mesopotamia. To the Assyrian Empire. And to a king who wanted to be remembered not just for cruelty, though he was plenty cruel, but for his love of books. Ashurbanipal. He ruled in the 7th century BCE, at the height of Assyria's power. And while most kings like to brag about the size of their palaces, their armies, or how many neighbors they'd crushed that week, Ashurbanipal bragged about something different, his ability to read. That sounds underwhelming to us, but for a king back then, it was rare. Reading and writing were jobs for scribes. Kings gave orders, scribes made wedge marks on clay, and that was that. But Ashurbanipal? He wanted to do the scribbling himself. Naturally, once you can read, you start collecting. And once you're an Assyrian king, collecting doesn't mean browsing a shop. It means ordering soldiers to loot temples and scribal houses, carrying off anything remotely tablet-shaped. He wanted everything: omens, myths, medical recipes, hymns, tax records, letters. If it could be written down, he wanted it in Nineveh. And so, his palace filled with tablets. Tens of thousands of them. Some say over 30,000. That's a lot of baked mud. And yes, many were duplicates. He liked having backups. But together, they formed the greatest library the ancient world had ever seen. Among its treasures was the Epic of Gilgamesh. Without Ashurbanipal's hoarding, we might never have heard of Gilgamesh sulking around Mesopotamia, befriending a wild man, and worrying about death after a giant flood. Other tablets described omens in exhausting detail: sheep entrails, bird flights, dreams, all turned into cosmic signs. Honestly, if you believed them all, doom was always around the corner. Then there were the medical texts, which swung between surprisingly practical, wash the wound with beer, and slightly alarming, burn turtle shell and smear the ashes on patient. You had to take the good with the bizarre. And Ashurbanipal collected it all. Because he understood, in a way few kings did, that knowledge was power. Knowing the will of the gods, the cures for disease, the histories of conquered lands, all of it mattered. Armies could win battles, but knowledge shaped how people thought about the world. And he wanted that under lock and key. Not that he was gentle about it. He was still an Assyrian king, which meant cruelty was basically part of the uniform. He paraded defeated kings in chains. He had prisoners mutilated. His inscriptions brag about the bodies piled outside city gates. So yes, he was a bibliophile, but one with very bloody hands. Imagine a librarian who insists you return books on time, or else. Of course, empires fall. After Ashurbanipal, Assyria unraveled. By 612 BCE, Nineveh was besieged and burned. The palace went up in flames. But here's the twist: those flames preserved the tablets. When clay is caught in fire, it hardens. Instead of crumbling, the tablets baked, like pottery. The palace collapsed, but the library survived, buried in ruins. 2,000 years later, 19th century archaeologists dug into Nineveh and stumbled across piles of tablets. At first, they didn't realize what they'd found. Just stacks of bricks with odd wedge marks. Slowly, though, scholars cracked cuneiform, and the voices of Mesopotamia came back to life. Priests muttering prayers. Kings issuing decrees. Farmers recording debts. Doctors prescribing beer for wounds. It was all there. Victorian scholars, being Victorians, loved the dramatic bits. They waved around Gilgamesh's flood story as proof of the Bible, while ignoring the less glamorous parts, like endless shipping manifests. Because nothing ruins a good discovery like realizing half the library is tax paperwork. Still, the rediscovery was extraordinary. Ashurbanipal's obsession with collecting, his need to gather every scrap of knowledge, gave us a window into a vanished world. Without him, the voices of Mesopotamia might have faded completely. Instead, we can still read their stories, their fears, their attempts to understand the stars, the gods, and their own aching teeth. And maybe that's the comforting thought to end on. That even in an empire built on conquest, one man decided words mattered too. That tablets could outlast kings. That scribbles in clay could carry across millennia, baked into permanence by fire. So next time you look at your cluttered bookshelf, or your endless stack of to-be-read PDFs, remember Ashurbanipal. You're just following in the footsteps of the world's first obsessive book hoarder. The difference is, his collection survived 3,000 years. Yours probably won't make it past your next house move. And with that, we'll close the dusty shelves of Nineveh. For stories behind us now, whispers in the palace, broken dreams in the night, a beacon blazing over the sea, and clay tablets stacked in silence. Each one a reminder that history is strange, fragile, and a little bit funny when you look at it sideways. So let your eyes close, let your breathing slow, and drift into your own second sleep. History will still be here when you wake. But while empires were rising and falling elsewhere, the Sahara was telling a quieter, yet no less important, story. Instead of palaces and feasts, we find ourselves in a vast, endless expanse of sand. The Sahara Desert. Now, I know what you're thinking. The desert? That sounds boring. And yeah, that's the point. Because few things are more sleep-inducing than endless sand dunes, the slow plod of camels, and the faint sound of wind brushing across nothingness. But here's the thing, the Sahara wasn't empty. For centuries, caravans wound across it, hauling one of the most valuable goods of the medieval world, salt. Yes, salt. Not gold, not jewels, not exotic spices. Just salt. White, crystalline, ordinary seeming salt. The stuff that today comes in paper shakers at diners. But back then, it was life. You needed it to preserve food, to survive heat, to trade. In fact, salt was so valuable that some records claim it was literally worth its weight in gold. Imagine dragging giant slabs of it across dunes that stretched farther than your patience, and you've got yourself a Saharan caravan. And caravans weren't small. Sometimes hundreds, even thousands, of camels plodded single file across the desert, each loaded with 2 massive blocks of salt strapped to their sides. Each camel moved at the same pace, slow, steady, unbothered. And if you've ever listened to a camel walk, you know it's not a gallop or a trot. It's a lazy, loping step that sounds like the world's sleepiest metronome. Perfect bedtime pacing. Picture it. The sun has set. The heat is finally ebbing away. The sky is turning that impossible desert twilight, violet bleeding into black, stars already piercing through. And the caravan keeps moving, bells jingling softly from the camels' necks, merchants murmuring low conversations, the sand crunching under padded hooves. It's not silence, exactly. It's rhythm. A rhythm so steady it could rock you into sleep. And this wasn't a one-night journey. These salt roads stretched for weeks, even months. Crossing from the mines at Tagaza, where men hacked salt from the earth, to the trading cities like Timbuktu and Gao, where gold, books, and goods from half the known world would change hands. Every night on the road was the same: walk, rest, eat, and watch the desert sky do its thing. So tonight, we'll follow them. Slowly, step by step, across dunes, oases, and silent camps, listening to the bells, the winds, the whispers of men who thought carrying salt across the Sahara was a good business plan. And with that, let's take our first slow step into the desert. So, before we set off into those endless dunes, let's slow down and take a look at how a caravan actually came together. Because no one just woke up one morning and thought, you know what, I'll walk across the Sahara with 300 camels. It took planning. Slow, deliberate, exhausting planning. First, you needed camels. Not just any camels, but dromedaries, the one-humped variety, also known as the ships of the desert. And honestly, they earned that title. Camels could go days without water, carry up to 300 pounds of salt or goods, and walk with the kind of stubborn determination that said, yes, I will get there, and no, I don't care if you're comfortable. But getting camels ready wasn't as simple as loading them up. They had to be fed and watered carefully in the days leading up to departure, checked for injuries, fitted with saddles and ropes. Each camel's load was balanced, because a poorly tied salt block meant the animal might refuse to move. And when a camel refuses, you're not winning that argument. You're waiting it out while the camel stares at you like you've ruined its entire week. Then came the supplies. Caravans carried everything they needed, because the Sahara was not exactly brimming with snack stands. Water skins, carefully sealed to survive the heat. Bags of dried dates, flatbread, and sometimes salted meat. Cooking pots, mats, tents, lamps. Merchants brought little luxuries too: incense, small charms, even books, because long nights in the desert got boring fast. The people were just as important as the camels. You had caravan leaders, seasoned men who knew the routes like the backs of their weathered hands. Guides who could read the stars with unnerving accuracy, steering a line of camels through dunes that all looked the same to anyone else. Drivers walked alongside, coaxing the camels forward, singing low, steady songs to keep the animals calm. And of course, merchants themselves, men who had invested everything into those salt slabs, hoping to trade them for gold, grain, or fabrics in faraway cities. And let's not forget the rituals. Departures weren't just logistical, they were spiritual. Before setting out, caravans often gathered for blessings. Prayers were whispered for safety, for rain at the right times, for protection from bandits or spirits of the desert. Because once you stepped into the dunes, you were in a place where human rules felt thin. The desert was vast, indifferent, and capable of swallowing entire expeditions. A blessing or two felt like a reasonable insurance policy. Finally, the moment of departure. Camels groaned as loads were strapped on. Bells jingled softly as lines were formed, camel after camel tied nose to tail, stretching out into what looked like a moving snake of beasts and men. Dust kicked up. Voices called out in half a dozen dialects. Children and families waved from the edge of the town. And then, slowly, with no fanfare except the shuffle of hooves, the caravan walked forward into the pale horizon. It wasn't fast. It wasn't glorious. It was steady. A slow crawl into the vastness of the Sahara, where time stretched, sound softened, and every step was both routine and monumental. And with that, the caravan was on the road, days and weeks ahead, each one marked by the same rhythm of hooves, wind, and silence. Which means it's time for us to drift into part 3, the life of the caravan on the road, the plodding steps, the long silences, and the strangely soothing monotony of desert travel. So, the caravan is moving now. Camels swaying, bells jingling softly, merchants muttering as the town disappears behind them. From here on, it's just dunes, heat, and the kind of monotony that slowly eats away at your sense of time. But for a sleepy bedtime stroll, monotony is perfect. The pace was slow. Camels walked at about 3 miles an hour, which sounds decent until you realize they kept that up for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. Step, sway, crunch. Step, sway, crunch. Over and over, like the world's longest meditation exercise. And the desert rewarded patience. Rush, and you'd collapse. Take it slow, and the desert let you pass. Life on the road wasn't glamorous. Travelers ate dates, flatbread, and salted meat, sometimes softened in water to make it less like chewing leather. Water was rationed carefully, measured out from skins and gourds at specific stops. People sipped, never gulped. Because in the Sahara, wasting water was basically wasting your life. The sounds of the caravan became its lullaby. The soft creak of leather straps. The pad of hooves pressing into sand. Low songs from drivers, sung not for entertainment but to keep the camels moving. Deep, rhythmic chants that echoed across the dunes. Every now and then, someone shouted instructions, and the line shifted slightly, like a great animal adjusting its gait. Rest stops were simple. When the sun was too much, they halted in shade if they could find it, maybe under a rocky outcrop, maybe just beside the camels themselves. Loads were checked. Water skins inspected. A little food passed around. And always, someone kept watch. The desert was open, but that didn't mean it was empty. At night, the caravan came alive in a softer way. Tents were pitched, mats spread, fires lit low to conserve fuel. Men sat in circles, eating from shared bowls, telling stories of past journeys or distant cities. Gossip traveled almost as fast as trade, who had grown rich, who had gone bankrupt, who had lost their camels to a storm or worse. And above them, the stars blazed. Not a handful, not the dim twinkles city people know, but thousands, crowding the sky, clear enough to navigate by. Guides pointed to constellations like they were signposts, because for them, they were. And then, sleep. The desert at night was not silent, it sighed with wind, whispered with shifting sand, sometimes even echoed with animal calls from creatures adapted to the darkness. But compared to the clamor of the day, it was soft, steady, and oddly reassuring. Caravan life was repetition. Walk, eat, rest, sleep. Do it again tomorrow. And the next day. And the day after that. The rhythm itself became its own world, where time stretched out and blurred. Which, honestly, is perfect for us, because the slower the story gets, the closer we drift to sleep. Next, we'll pause at an oasis, those rare green interruptions in the desert sea, where caravans watered camels, swapped stories with strangers, and sometimes remembered what shade actually felt like. So, we've trudged through the dunes. Sand in our sandals, camels groaning, everyone slightly annoyed but too tired to care. And then, finally, like a mirage that doesn't vanish when you rub your eyes, there it is, an oasis. An oasis wasn't just a pit stop. It was life. Green palms swaying, pools of water glinting in the sun, birds circling overhead like they had been waiting for you all along. After days of dry wind and endless sand, the sight of shade and water must have felt almost holy. Caravans clustered here to rest. Camels were led to the pools and allowed to drink until their necks quivered with relief. Drivers filled skins, splashed water on their faces, and sometimes dunked their entire heads in, just to remember what cool felt like. Merchants spread mats under the palms, stretched aching legs, and chewed their dates slowly, savoring the fact that for once, the world wasn't entirely beige. And oases weren't empty. They were crossroads, tiny hubs where caravans intersected. Traders from the north, south, east, and west all stopped here, so the air buzzed with languages, gossip, and the low hum of bargaining. Who had salt from Tagaza? Who had gold from the Niger? Who had cloth, glass, or books to sell? Deals were whispered, alliances made, rivalries rekindled, all while camels slurped noisily beside them. At night, oases turned into miniature villages of tents. Fires flickered. Stories were told, sometimes about great cities like Timbuktu or Marrakesh, sometimes about less cheerful things, like sandstorms that swallowed whole caravans. Not that anyone wanted to dwell on those before bedtime, but you know how humans are. If something might kill you, you're definitely going to tell stories about it by firelight. And there were the superstitions. Some said spirits haunted certain oases. That travelers who strayed too far at night might hear voices in the dunes, or see strange lights flickering in the distance. Most dismissed these as tricks of wind and sand, but still, better to stay close to camp. It wasn't just ghosts people feared, either. Bandits were a real risk, though the bigger the caravan, the safer it was. Safety in numbers, even if those numbers included grumpy camels who would spit at you if you got too close. But mostly, oases were calm. A reprieve. A pause in the monotony of crunching sand and dry throats. A place where life felt almost normal, even if only for a night or two. And then, as always, it was time to pack up again. Camels reloaded, bells jingled, lines reformed. The caravan shuffled back into the desert, leaving only footprints and a few stray palm fronds behind. And so the rhythm began again. Step, sway, crunch. Water skins creaking, drivers humming low songs, the desert swallowing sound. For weeks, this cycle continued. Dunes, oases, nights under impossible stars, until finally, the caravan reached its goal. The great trade cities where all this salt would be turned into wealth, books, and reputation. Which is where we'll head next, into the bustling markets of Timbuktu, Tagaza, and Gao, where salt was more than just a block of rock, it was currency, culture, and survival. After weeks of sand, silence, and camels that glared at you like you'd personally offended them, the caravan finally arrived at its destination, the great trade hubs of West Africa. And if the desert was monotonous, the cities were the exact opposite, alive, bustling, noisy in a way that felt almost overwhelming after so much wind and hoofbeat rhythm. One of the most famous stops was Tagaza, a settlement that wasn't really known for its comfort. Imagine a place where the houses were literally built out of salt blocks. Not stone, not mud, salt. The entire town was basically a salt quarry with walls. Life there was harsh, but the resource was so valuable that caravans kept pouring in. Men dug giant slabs of salt out of the earth, each one heavy enough to break your back if you weren't careful, and stacked them like treasure. To the merchants, these slabs weren't just minerals, they were walking gold bars. From Tagaza, salt moved on to Timbuktu, which by the 14th and 15th centuries was more than a city. It was a legend. Timbuktu was a place where salt wasn't just traded for gold, but where knowledge itself was currency. Scholars gathered, libraries flourished, and manuscripts filled with philosophy, law, and astronomy passed from hand to hand. Imagine a merchant arriving with a line of camels crusted in desert dust, selling his slabs of salt, and then strolling into a market where he could also buy books copied by hand. Salt preserved food, manuscripts preserved ideas. Both kept civilizations alive in their own way. And then there was Gao, another city on the Niger River, a place where gold, ivory, and slaves were exchanged, and where salt was always in demand. Caravans arriving here didn't just sell their goods, they transformed them into connections, into wealth that would ripple outward into other kingdoms. A block of salt cut into Gaza might eventually end up seasoning a dish in a noble's house hundreds of miles away. The markets themselves were sensory overload. Merchants shouting, buyers haggling, camels snorting, children weaving through crowds, drums thumping somewhere in the background. Goods from across continents mingled. Glass from the Mediterranean, fabrics from North Africa, gold dust from local mines, and of course, piles and piles of salt slabs stacked like small fortresses. If you listened closely, you'd hear half a dozen languages colliding in the same space. Trade wasn't quiet, It was a roar. But beneath all the noise, there was still rhythm. The same slow bargaining, the same careful weighing of goods, the same ritual of handshakes and promises. Trade wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate. The salt roads that carried caravans across endless dunes also carried trust, tradition, and the knowledge that without this exchange, life in both the desert and the cities beyond it would grind to a halt. And when the deals were done, the merchants rested. Caravans paused for weeks, sometimes months, while goods changed hands and camels recovered. New journeys were planned, new routes chosen, and slowly, inevitably, the cycle would begin again. Back into the desert, back to the dunes, back to the rhythm of sand and silence. But before we send them off again, we'll linger a little longer, because caravan life wasn't just business. It was full of superstitions, dangers, and the quiet resilience of travelers who lived half their lives on the move. And that's where we'll drift next. Our caravans have reached the cities, sold their salt, and rested for a while. But life in the Sahara was never just about trade. The desert carried its own rules, its own dangers, and its own set of quiet beliefs that shaped every journey. One of the most unsettling challenges was the sandstorm. Great walls of dust and wind would sweep across the dunes, blotting out the horizon and swallowing the caravan in a brown blur. To the men walking those roads, it was terrifying. To us, told in a softer voice, it feels more like the desert's way of pressing pause. The storm forced everyone to stop, cover their faces, crouch low, and wait. Then, when the wind passed, the silence returned heavier than before. Footprints disappeared, landmarks vanished, and the desert rearranged itself as though nothing had happened. Getting lost was another risk. The Sahara didn't offer road signs or reliable paths. But this is where the guides mattered most. These men could read the stars as easily as others read a book, navigating by constellations, the slant of a dune, even the whisper of a breeze. To outsiders, it looked like magic. To them, it was practice, patience, and knowledge passed down through generations. Thirst, though, was the most constant danger. Water was measured out with a precision that bordered on reverence. No one gulped. Everyone sipped. And when a well appeared, relief spread quietly through the group. The sound of water sloshing into skins was music, soft, ordinary, but life itself. Alongside these challenges lived the beliefs that made the desert feel alive. Travelers spoke of voices in the dunes, of flickering lights on the horizon that led men astray. Some carried charms, beads, bits of metal, scraps of holy text, small tokens against the desert's indifference. Almost every caravan began with blessings, prayers whispered toward the horizon before the first camel set its foot forward. And through all of this, caravans endured. Not loudly, not heroically, but with a quiet toughness. The rhythm of walking, resting, and moving again built a kind of strength that wasn't about glory, but persistence. Time was measured in dunes past, in stars crossed overhead, in the steady plod of hooves across sand. It was a resilience born not from dramatic triumphs, but from the calm decision to keep moving. To hum softly to a camel in the stillness of night. To trust the guide's eyes on the constellations. To sip water sparingly, step by steady step, until the next horizon appeared. And so the caravans carried on, through storms, through thirst, through silence. Always forward. Always deeper into the dunes. The markets have grown quiet, the deals are finished, and the caravan is on the move again. But for tonight, the road pauses. The desert has its own kind of rest, and if the day belongs to heat and dust, then the night belongs to silence. The sand cools quickly once the sun is gone. What burned your feet in the afternoon is now soft and almost cold to the touch. Fires are lit, but they're small, just enough to boil water, to warm a handful of dates, to keep a circle of men gathered close. Their voices fall into low tones, half stories, half prayers, while the camels settle into the sand with deep, guttural sighs. And above it all, the sky stretches open. Not the thin sprinkling of stars you see from a city street, but thousands upon thousands, burning clear and sharp. The desert gave travelers no roads, but it gave them the heavens, and the guides knew every constellation like an old friend. They pointed quietly, this one leads east, that one marks the north, another shows the season turning. In their voices, the stars became as familiar as milestones on a map. Eventually, the talk faded. Men lay back on mats, eyes fixed upward until sleep pulled them under. The camels shifted, chewed lazily, then stilled. The fires burned low, throwing just enough glow to mark the outlines of tents and figures. Beyond that small circle, the desert was vast, endless, and quiet. But not silent. The wind brushed lightly over the dunes, hissing like a whisper. Sand shifted softly, sliding down the slopes in tiny streams. Now and then, a dog barked from some far-off encampment, or an owl called into the night. Each sound felt sharper in the stillness, but also gentler, softened by the space around it. And then, as the hours stretched, even those sounds drifted away. What was left was the slow breathing of the caravan itself, a rhythm of sleep, steady and reassuring. The desert, indifferent by day, felt almost protective by night, its silence wrapping around the camp like a blanket. Now, we're going someplace warmer. Sunlight on marble, olive groves swaying in the wind, and the faint smell of volcanic fumes that may or may not be making everyone a little dizzy. Welcome to Delphi, home of the most famous oracle in the ancient world. Now, if you've ever thought your horoscope was vague, just wait until you meet the Pythia. She was the high priestess of Apollo, perched on a tripod over a mysterious chasm, whispering riddles that determined the fate of kings and empires. Was she divinely inspired, or just extremely high on fumes? Scholars still argue. Either way, people lined up from across the known world to hear her mumble something that could mean literally anything. So tonight, we're going to wander through the shrine of Apollo. We'll listen to the whispers, smirk at the weirdness, and watch as entire kingdoms hinge on the words of a woman in a trance. No drama, no explosions, just a lot of vague advice and the occasional suspicious donation of gold. All right, dim the lights, settle in, and let's walk up the sacred way together. First, let's get our bearings. Delphi sat on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, overlooking a sweeping valley of olive trees that seems to roll on forever. The location itself was dramatic: steep cliffs, a crisp mountain breeze, and a view that probably convinced more than one visitor that yes, the gods definitely lived here. The Greeks were very into the whole theater of nature vibe, and Delphi nailed it. The sanctuary was dedicated to Apollo, god of music, light, reason, and apparently also cryptic advice that could ruin your life if you misinterpreted it. The centerpiece was the Temple of Apollo, where the oracle did her thing. But the place was more than just a temple. It was a whole complex: treasuries, statues, altars, fountains, all built from the offerings of cities trying to one-up each other. Imagine a divine gift shop crossed with a political flex zone. And then, of course, there was the oracle herself. The Pythia. She wasn't just any woman, though the qualifications weren't exactly Ivy League. Tradition said she had to be a local, older, and living a life of chastity. Which, translated, usually meant a middle-aged woman chosen by the priests who ran the sanctuary. Once selected, she basically became the mouthpiece of Apollo. Her job? Sit on a tripod, inhale the mysterious vapors rising from the ground, and then mutter things in a trance that the priests would translate. Now, whether those fumes were divine, geological, or just very bad air conditioning is still debated. Some modern geologists say Delphi sits on a fault line that released gases like ethylene, which can cause euphoria and disorientation. So, yes, the oracle may have been speaking to Apollo, or she may have just been really, really high. But hey, if the advice sounded profound, who cared? Pilgrims came from everywhere. Before meeting the oracle, they had to go through a whole ritual. Purify themselves in the Castalian spring, sacrifice a goat, and pay a hefty fee, because spiritual wisdom was never free. Then, after waiting their turn, they'd finally be ushered into the temple, where the Pythia sat in her trance. The air was heavy with incense, the light dim, the stone walls echoing every whisper. And then she would speak. Or, more accurately, she would babble. The priests would take her words, scribble them down, polish them up into something poetic, and voila, prophecy. And of course, it was always just vague enough to fit any outcome. Ask if you'll win a war, and the oracle might say, a great empire will fall. Which, sure, but whose empire? Yours or theirs? Details. Details. The genius of the oracle was never being wrong, because no one ever agreed on what she'd actually meant until after it happened. But here's the thing. People believed. Kings, generals, city-states, they trusted the oracle's whispers more than their own generals. They made huge decisions based on her words. Go to war. Marry this princess. Found a colony. Ask the Pythia first. Which is hilarious, considering the fate of empires was basically resting on the slurred mumblings of a woman inhaling questionable fumes. And yet, that belief made Delphi powerful. Not just religiously, but politically and economically. City-states poured treasure into the sanctuary. Lavish statues, golden tripods, entire treasuries filled with loot, all donations to Apollo. Which also conveniently advertised how rich and powerful the donor city was. The sacred way up to the temple was basically a catwalk of ancient propaganda. Corinth showing off here, Athens flexing there, Sparta quietly sharpening its spears in the corner. So Delphi wasn't just a place of prophecy. It was the ancient world's political stage. A place where whispers could steer wars, where gold bought prestige, and where everyone pretended they were here for spiritual reasons while also side-eyeing their rivals' donations. So, you've made it to Delphi. You've trudged up the sacred way, past all the flashy treasuries and statues. You've purified yourself in the sacred spring, sacrificed your goat, and emptied your purse into the sanctuary coffers. Now you're standing outside the temple of Apollo, wondering how exactly this world-changing prophecy thing actually works. Well, let's step inside. The temple itself wasn't some enormous cathedral. It was actually pretty modest compared to all the treasuries cluttering the hillside. But inside was the real magic, the Adyton, the inner chamber where the oracle Saturday. And here's where the strangeness began. The Pythia, the priestess, would seat herself on a tripod, basically a three-legged stool, placed over a fissure in the earth. From this fissure, the mysterious vapors supposedly rose. Add incense, chanting, and the general vibe of ancient health and safety violations, and you had the perfect recipe for altered states of consciousness. The ritual to prepare the oracle was long and specific. First, the priests checked the omens. They might sprinkle water on a goat and watch how it reacted. If the goat shivered, the signs were good. If it didn't, tough luck, no prophecy today. Which, by the way, was a brilliant system. If the oracle didn't feel like working, suddenly the goat had mysteriously refused to give its blessing. If the omens looked favorable, the Pythia would then purify herself with a bath in the Castalian spring, chew some bay leaves, because nothing says divine inspiration like chewing shrubbery, and take a seat over the fissure. The atmosphere was heavy with incense, the flicker of oil lamps danced on the walls, and a hush fell over the temple. The stage was set. Now, what happened next depends on who you ask. Ancient writers described the oracle entering a trance, trembling, and speaking in strange voices. Some said she raved, others said she mumbled, others insisted she spoke clearly but cryptically. Whatever she did, it wasn't exactly a TED talk. Her words were messy, fragmented, and often unintelligible. Which is where the priests came in. The priests of Apollo acted as translators, or, let's be honest, editors. They took the oracle's raw words and polished them into elegant hexameter verse. You asked if you should invade Persia. The Pythia babbled something about ships and shadows. Don't worry, the priests would turn it into a neat little couplet about a mighty empire falling. A prophecy vague enough to cover all bases, yet poetic enough to sound divine. This dual system, one woman babbling, a team of priests tidying it up, is probably why the oracle seemed so mysterious and wise. It wasn't just the fumes. It was the management. Let's pause here to talk about those fumes. For centuries, skeptics doubted they even existed. Ancient sources mentioned them, but later excavations didn't find much. Then, in the 1990s, geologists studied the site and discovered that yes, Delphi sits right on a fault line. The rock below contains bitumen and ethylene gas. When fissures opened, gases could seep upward. Ethylene, in small doses, causes euphoria, dizziness, and a dreamlike state. In higher doses, it can cause trance-like speech. So, it turns out the ancients weren't exaggerating. The oracle was basically hotboxing on a geological vaporizer. But here's the catch, not every session would have been the same. Sometimes the gases flowed, sometimes they didn't. which may explain why some days the oracle was too sick to deliver prophecies. Science and religion were literally leaking out of the rocks together. And of course, the priests controlled access to all of this. You didn't just stroll in and ask the oracle for life advice. The Delphic sanctuary had a whole waiting system. Big, powerful states, Sparta, Athens, Corinth, got priority. Smaller cities or private individuals waited in line. Unless, of course, you were willing to donate a little extra gold. Then, somehow, your turn came sooner. Divine wisdom may have been free, but scheduling it was definitely pay to play. This meant the oracle wasn't just a spiritual figure. She was part of a whole bureaucracy. Pilgrims lined up. Fees were collected. Priests managed the traffic. Scribes wrote down responses. It was basically the ancient world's DMV, except instead of a driver's license, you got a prophecy that might ruin your life. The Pythia herself only gave oracles on certain days, originally once a year, then later once a month, which added to the mystique. You couldn't just pop by on a Tuesday and ask if your marriage was going to work out. You had to wait, purify, pay, and hope the goat shivered. All of this built suspense and authority. By the time you actually stood in front of her, you were primed to believe that whatever she said was sacred truth. And honestly, it worked. People came away awestruck, carrying prophecies back to their cities like sacred treasures. Whether or not they understood them was a different matter. But they believed. And belief, more than anything else, is what made Delphi powerful. So picture it. A dim chamber. The Pythia trembling on her tripod, her voice rising and falling like wind through the stones. Priests hovering nearby, ears sharp, pens ready. A nervous general waiting for his answer. Outside, the sacred way glitters with statues, offerings, and the quiet shuffle of pilgrims. And in the heart of it all, the whispering walls of Delphi breathe out another riddle. So, what exactly did the oracle say? We've got this dramatic setup, the temple, the fumes, the priests with their pens. But what about the words themselves? The Pythia didn't exactly hand out clear bullet point lists of advice. Instead, she specialized in something far more useful, cryptic one-liners that sounded profound but could mean almost anything. And honestly, that was the genius of Delphi. Never be wrong by never being clear. One of the most famous examples was given to King Croesus of Lydia. Croesus was ridiculously wealthy, so wealthy that even today, people say rich as Croesus. But he was also curious about testing the oracle's accuracy. Before launching a war against Persia, he asked what would happen. The oracle replied, "If you cross the river Halys, a great empire will fall." Croesus was thrilled. Clearly that meant Persia's empire would collapse. He crossed the river, went to war, and promptly got crushed by Cyrus the Great. Turns out the prophecy was accurate. An empire did fall, just not the one Croesus had in mind. A little reminder that the oracle always left herself a loophole. Then there's the story of the Battle of Salamis during the Persian Wars. The Athenians, terrified of Xerxes' massive invasion force, ran to Delphi for advice. The oracle's response? Something about the Greeks finding safety behind wooden walls. Now, interpretations varied. Some Athenians thought it meant literally building a wooden palisade around the Acropolis. Others suggested it referred to their navy. Fortunately for Greece, the naval interpretation won out. The Athenians trusted their triremes, fought the Persians at Salamis, and managed a stunning victory. If they'd gone with the wooden fence idea, history would have looked very different. So yes, the prophecy was brilliant, vague enough to cover both interpretations, but poetic enough that later historians could nod and say, "See? The oracle was right." Another gem comes from Sparta. Before the legendary Battle of Thermopylae, the oracle told the Spartans that either their city would be destroyed or one of their kings must die. Leonidas, naturally, took this as his cue to march off to certain death with 300 of his best-dressed warriors. And while the Spartans technically lost the battle, the prophecy was again validated. The king died. The city survived. Box ticked. Prophecy fulfilled. It's almost like the oracle was a master of conditional statements. Heads I win, tails you lose. But either way I was technically correct. Sometimes, Though, the prophecies got almost absurdly cryptic. A colonist might ask whether founding a city in some swampy corner of the Mediterranean was a good idea. The oracle would say something like, "You will be happy there, after much suffering." Which is both unhelpful and completely inevitable. Of course you'll suffer building a city from scratch. That's like telling someone moving apartments that you will sweat, but eventually you will rest. Thanks, Apollo. And then there were the wordplay prophecies. The oracle loved puns. For instance, King Aegeus asked about having children, and the oracle told him, "Do not loosen the bulging mouth of the wineskin until you return to Athens." Which sounds less like divine wisdom and more like oddly specific drinking advice. Naturally, he misunderstood it, fathered Theseus on the way home, and the rest is mythological history. This was the pattern. People came to Delphi desperate for clarity, and the oracle gave them riddles. And the more desperate they were, the more meaning they squeezed from those riddles. Which is maybe the secret to why the oracle lasted so long. When people really want an answer, they'll find one, even if it's hidden in nonsense. But let's not forget the political edge. The oracle wasn't operating in a vacuum. The priests of Delphi were well informed. They had pilgrims coming in from across the Greek world, carrying news, gossip, and rumors. So when the Pythia spoke, her divine words often conveniently aligned with the current political climate. If Corinth was growing restless, maybe Apollo suddenly warned against certain alliances. If Sparta was on the rise, maybe Apollo whispered about Spartan destiny. It wasn't just prophecy, it was spin. And the beauty of it was that no one could call it propaganda, because technically it came from the gods. And the fame of Delphi spread far beyond Greece. Foreign rulers sent gifts and asked for advice. Croesus, we mentioned. Later, even the Romans paid attention. The oracle's riddles shaped not just city-states, but empires. That's a lot of influence for what was, at its core, a woman mumbling while priests furiously edited her lines into poetry. So picture it. You're a nervous general. You've brought your offerings, chewed your bay leaves, and now you're standing in the temple. The Pythia shakes, her voice rises, the priests scribble, and then you hear the verdict: a great empire will fall. Or trust in the wooden walls. Or beware the bulging wineskin. Do you understand it? Not really. Do you believe it? Absolutely. And that belief might just send you marching into history, or into disaster. So, we've heard the riddles. But who were the people asking them? The oracle at Delphi didn't spend her days advising farmers on crop rotations or helping shepherds decide which hillside was best for their goats. No, this was a high-stakes oracle. The visitors were kings, generals, and ambassadors, which meant the prophecies were less about will my sheep survive the winter, and more about should I risk my entire army on this war I'm not sure I can win. And naturally, when you gather a bunch of ambitious rulers desperate for reassurance, the results are both predictable and, well, a little funny. Take Croesus of Lydia, again. He's the poster child for misinterpreting oracles. After his disastrous war with Persia, he actually survived and was brought before Cyrus the Great. Legend says he complained to Apollo, "Why did you trick me?" And Apollo, in true godlike fashion, apparently answered that the oracle had spoken the truth. Croesus had just been too thick to understand it. Which is kind of like blaming your GPS when you drive into a lake. The instructions were technically correct. You just weren't. Then there were the Spartans. Oh, the Spartans loved Delphi. They treated Apollo like their personal life coach. When they weren't busy training for war, they were sending ambassadors to Delphi, asking if the gods approved of their next round of flexing. The oracle often gave them a green light, probably because Sparta's military reputation was intimidating enough that even priests thought twice before giving them bad news. But occasionally, the oracle slipped in some snark. At one point, when the Spartans were getting too arrogant, Apollo reportedly warned them that their city would only survive as long as it respected the voice of the oracle. Translation: don't get too cocky, or we'll start giving your enemies better riddles. Subtle, but effective. Athens, meanwhile, had a more complicated relationship. They got the famous wooden walls prophecy before Salamis, which turned out well. But the Athenians were also a democracy, meaning they sent committees to Delphi. Imagine a group of squabbling politicians trying to agree on what the oracle meant. You can almost hear the arguments. Clearly she meant build ships. No, clearly she meant build fences. No, clearly she meant both. Democracy at work, folks. Even when dealing with divine whispers, Athenians managed to argue about it for hours. And then there were the cities that used Delphi for propaganda. Some would brag that Apollo favored them, pointing to a conveniently flattering prophecy. Others would pay for lavish statues or treasuries at Delphi, hoping the oracle would accidentally lean their way in future disputes. It was less about divine wisdom and more about ancient lobbying. And just like modern lobbying, money often spoke louder than principle. For example, Athens once built an entire treasury at Delphi after defeating the Persians, stuffed with trophies of war. It wasn't just a gift to Apollo. It was a massive billboard screaming, "Look how great we are." Every visitor walking up the sacred way saw it. The prophecy might have been vague, but the message was crystal clear. Athens wanted everyone to know it was now a big deal. But Delphi didn't always hand out flattery. Sometimes, the oracle was brutally honest, or at least, that's how it was remembered. When asked what Sparta's fate would be if it invaded Arcadia, the oracle allegedly said, "You will capture it. But beware, for many dancers will tread on your plain." Which sounds nice until you realize dancers was code for soldiers trampling Spartan land after their inevitable defeat. Once again, vague, poetic, and just sharp enough to sting. Foreign rulers also came knocking. After all, Apollo didn't stop at the Greek border. Croesus, as we saw, made the trip. Other kings sent rich gifts, hoping Apollo's whispers could cross cultural lines. Delphi basked in this international fame. The more exotic the visitor, the more prestige the oracle gained. Imagine a line of ambassadors in colorful robes, each clutching golden bowls or ivory statues, all waiting their turn to hear some muttered riddle. The priests must have been thrilled. Not only was Apollo getting attention, but the sanctuary was practically drowning in treasure. And speaking of treasure, one of the most human sides of Delphi was the constant tug-of-war over money. Cities stored their wealth there for safekeeping, assuming no one would dare rob Apollo. Which worked, until it didn't. More than once, invading armies looted Delphi, carrying off gold that had been safely entrusted to the god. But even here, the oracle had a clever escape clause. If the looters suffered bad luck afterward, it was declared punishment from Apollo. If they thrived, well, maybe Apollo secretly approved. Heads, the oracle wins. Tails, the humans were too sinful to deserve protection. Convenient. But beneath the grandeur, there were always little hints of stage management. Priests carefully chose which questions got answers, which prophecies got remembered, and which ones quietly disappeared. A ruler who donated generously, his prophecy would probably sound profound. A small-town pilgrim with nothing to give, his answer might be so vague it could apply to the weather. Spiritual wisdom, yes, but also very much customer service. So picture it again. A nervous king pacing outside the temple. Priests whispering, tallying gifts. The Pythia trembling on her tripod, her voice rising in riddles. A scribe polishing the words into poetry. And then the king walking away, clutching his prophecy like it's solid gold, not realizing it's actually just verbal smoke. Because that was the secret of Delphi, it wasn't about giving answers. It was about giving just enough to make you believe the answers were there. So, by now you've probably noticed something. All this whispering from Apollo wasn't just about divine truth. It was also, very conveniently, about keeping Delphi rich and important. And like any successful institution, the sanctuary ran on a mix of faith, politics, and a little creative accounting. Let's start with the treasuries. As you climbed the sacred way, that winding path up to Apollo's temple, you passed a row of small, fancy buildings. These weren't shops, despite looking suspiciously like ancient boutiques. They were miniature temples, called treasuries, built by individual city-states to store offerings and show off their wealth. Athens had one. Sparta had one. Corinth had one. It was like a neighborhood of ancient bank vaults crossed with ego shrines. Each treasury was crammed with gold, silver, weapons, and shiny things dedicated to Apollo. But of course, these weren't just gifts to the god. They were political flexes. A city could point to its treasury and say, "Look how generous we are to Apollo. Clearly, he favors us more than our rivals." It was basically divine one-upmanship in architectural form. And it wasn't just cities. Wealthy individuals also donated golden bowls, tripods, statues. Croesus of Lydia, for example, sent so much treasure to Delphi that the priests probably had to build new storage closets. He gave golden lions, mixing bowls, necklaces, even a throne. Imagine being so rich you donate your furniture to a foreign temple. Of course, the priests of Delphi made sure everyone knew exactly who had given what. Names were inscribed, dedications carved. It was the ancient equivalent of a donor wall at a university. And just like modern donor walls, the implication was clear: the bigger your gift, the better your treatment. Did Apollo really care about gold lions? Probably not. But the priests who managed his shrine? They definitely did. Now, running this operation required organization. The Amphictyonic League, a council of Greek states, oversaw Delphi's sanctuary. They were supposed to keep it neutral, protect its treasures, and manage the games held in Apollo's honor. But neutrality is a slippery word. In practice, the League was constantly squabbling, especially when powerful states like Athens or Thebes wanted more control. Delphi wasn't just a religious site, it was a political pawn. Wars were even fought over who got to manage it. Nothing says sacred like armies marching to seize the god's donation box. Inside the temple, meanwhile, the priests ran the show. They controlled the schedule, the fees, and the interpretations. Want your prophecy faster? Maybe a bigger donation will help. Want a slightly more flattering answer? Funny how Apollo always seemed more positive toward people who had just built him a shiny new treasury. Spiritual guidance with deluxe upgrades available. This didn't mean the oracle was a total scam. People genuinely believed. The Pythia herself likely entered real altered states, and the rituals had deep cultural roots. But layered on top of that faith was a very practical awareness of money and power. The whispers might come from Apollo, but the bookkeeping definitely came from the priests. And Delphi wasn't just sitting on treasure. It also hosted the Pythian Games, second only to the Olympics in prestige. These were held every 4 years, featuring music, poetry, and athletic contests. Unlike the Olympics, the Pythian Games had a big cultural focus: lyres, singing, recitations of Homer. So in addition to sweaty athletes, you also got poets dramatically declaiming while Apollo's priests nodded along. The games drew crowds, boosted Delphi's fame, and conveniently filled the local inns. A mix of sport, art, and ancient tourism. Tourism, actually, was key. Pilgrims poured into Delphi from all over the Mediterranean. They needed food, lodging, souvenirs. Local towns thrived on this steady stream of spiritual seekers. You can imagine stalls along the road selling cheap Apollo figurines, holy water in jars, and maybe a discounted bay leaf wreath, just like the Pythia wears. The oracle wasn't just a prophet. She was an economy. And yet, with all this wealth, Delphi had to constantly defend its reputation. Every time a prophecy turned out awkwardly vague or embarrassingly wrong, critics muttered. Every time the sanctuary looked too rich, reformers raised eyebrows. The priests walked a delicate line: keep the aura of mystery alive, but don't let the corruption show too clearly. Which, honestly, is the same balancing act every powerful institution has tried since forever. Of course, the sanctuary also had moments of scandal. There were accusations of bribery, rulers paying for favorable prophecies. There were times when rival city-states tried to seize the sanctuary outright. And there were whispers that the priests themselves manipulated the Pythia's words to suit their allies. Which, well, probably true. After all, if a king like Philip of Macedon showed up with gifts, are you really going to tell him Apollo said no? Probably safer to nod, smile, and phrase the prophecy so he hears what he wants. But maybe the most impressive trick of Delphi was how long it lasted. Through wars, invasions, plagues, shifting empires, the oracle kept whispering. Partly because people wanted it to. Partly because the sanctuary was politically useful. And partly because the system was just too good. Vague words, poetic riddles, generous donations. It was a self-sustaining cycle. You ask a question, you get a riddle, you interpret it however you want, and when you're wrong, you blame yourself, not the oracle. Brilliant. So picture Delphi again, not as a mystical foggy temple, but as a buzzing hub. Priests tallying donations. Ambassadors arguing over treasuries. Athletes jogging past poets tuning lyres. Pilgrims buying souvenirs. And somewhere in the middle, the Pythia, breathing the fumes, mumbling her riddles, while the whole machine whirred smoothly around her. Divine whispers. Yes. But also very human management. So, for centuries Delphi whispered away, turning vague one-liners into the fate of empires. But nothing in history lasts forever. Not even the gods of Greece. Slowly, almost quietly, the oracle began to lose her grip. The world outside was changing, and even Apollo's fumes couldn't keep up. The first cracks came with the Romans. By the 2nd century BCE, Greece had been swallowed up by Roman conquest. The Romans admired Greek culture. Yes. They copied Greek art, Greek literature, Greek statues, basically redecorated Rome with looted Greek originals. But the oracle? The Romans weren't quite as dazzled. That didn't stop them from visiting, of course. Emperors like Nero and Hadrian still made the pilgrimage. Nero even looted hundreds of statues from Delphi, because apparently Apollo's temple made a great shopping mall if you happened to be emperor. Hadrian, on the other hand, was more respectful. He loved Greek culture and tossed Delphi a revival, funding repairs and trying to restore some of its old glory. For a while, the sanctuary flickered back to life. But by this point, the oracle wasn't quite the global powerhouse she used to be. Her words were still respected, but Rome had its own gods, its own omens, its own augurs inspecting chicken entrails. And let's be honest, once you've built the Colosseum, a woman mumbling over fumes in a mountain shrine starts to feel a little provincial. Then came Christianity. By the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire was converting. Apollo's temple, once filled with incense and whispers, now looked suspiciously pagan. And pagan wasn't fashionable anymore. The new religion had its own prophets, its own holy words, its own sacred buildings. Suddenly, Delphi felt outdated, like an abandoned shopping mall after a new one opens down the road. The real end came under Emperor Theodosius I, who in 394 CE officially banned pagan rituals. That included sacrifices, offerings, and, yes, oracles. Apollo's whispering priestess was silenced by decree. The temple fell quiet, the fumes went unused, the sacred way stopped filling with pilgrims. The oracle of Delphi, after nearly 1,000 years, was done. Of course, legends lingered. Later writers claimed the oracle's final prophecy was one last poetic sigh. The hall has fallen, Apollo has no home, and the prophetic voice is gone. Which, if true, is a suitably dramatic mic drop for a 1,000-year-old career. More likely, the oracle just faded slowly, fewer visitors each year, until one day no one came at all. But the Greeks loved a good ending, so naturally they imagined Apollo himself declaring it over. After that, Delphi became ruins. Earthquakes shook the temple. Christians built churches nearby. Travelers passed by and wondered what had once stood there. The whispers were gone, but the stones remained. And in a way, that's fitting. Because the oracle was never really about accuracy. It was about atmosphere. About the setting, the ritual, the sense of awe. Once that atmosphere was gone, once the pilgrims stopped believing, the oracle had nothing left to say. The silence was the prophecy. Even so, Delphi's influence lingered. Historians still quote her riddles. Tourists still climb the sacred way. Archaeologists still uncover treasuries and statues. And modern geologists still argue about the exact mix of gases that may have fueled her visions. The oracle may have gone silent, but her whispers echo on in history books, museum displays, and slightly overdramatic documentaries. Picture it, one last time. The temple of Apollo, standing empty. The Pythia's tripod gathering dust. The fissure still there, but no one leaning over it. The sacred way, weeds creeping through its stones. The treasuries locked, their gold long stolen. And the mountains above Delphi, quiet, eternal, watching as one of the world's great voices faded into memory. Silence at last. So here we are. We've climbed the sacred way, breathed the incense, listened to the riddles, and watched the pilgrims shuffle home with prophecies that could mean everything or nothing. We've seen kings strut into Delphi, drop off treasure, and then promptly misunderstand the oracle so badly that they walked straight into their own defeats. We've seen priests tally donations, scribes polish cryptic one-liners, and an entire shrine balance somewhere between mystery and marketing. And then we watched it fade. The Romans passed through, Christianity rose, and Apollo's temple went silent. The fumes no longer mattered. The tripod stood empty. The whispers stopped. 1,000 years of riddles ended in a sigh. But here's the thing. Delphi was never really about predicting the future. Not accurately, anyway. It was about atmosphere. About that chill you felt standing in the temple, hearing words echo off the stone, knowing thousands had stood there before you. About believing, if only for a moment, that the gods had a plan, even if the plan sounded suspiciously like a riddle written by a poet on deadline. People wanted answers. Delphi gave them whispers. And that was enough. Because when you're desperate, a vague line about a great empire falling feels like certainty. And when things go wrong, you can always blame yourself, not Apollo. It was the perfect system. And maybe that's why we're still fascinated by it. Not because the oracle was right, but because she was never exactly wrong. Not because she spoke clearly, but because she spoke just vaguely enough that people kept listening. That's the strange human truth. Sometimes we prefer whispers over clarity. Sometimes we'd rather have riddles than facts. Because riddles let us hope. Today, Delphi is ruins. Quiet, sunlit, with tourists wandering through stones that once held the weight of empires. No incense, no chanting, no trembling voices. Just cicadas in the olive groves and the wind brushing through the mountains. But if you stand still, if you close your eyes, you might almost hear it, a faint murmur rising from the stones. The echo of a voice that once decided wars, marriages, and destinies. The whisper of Apollo, carried on the air. Or maybe it's just the wind. Which is, honestly, very Delphi. So as we leave Delphi behind, maybe take a little comfort in its silence. The oracle spoke for centuries, and yet she was never clear. Maybe clarity was never the point. Maybe the point was simply the ritual, the waiting, the hush of the temple, the weight of the words. The feeling that someone, somewhere, had an answer, even if the answer made no sense. But elsewhere, something very different was unfolding. We've left behind the Moorish fountains and the Irish monasteries for something brighter, literally. Picture yourself stepping into the lantern festivals of ancient China. Nights when whole cities glowed with thousands of lights, paper lanterns floated into the sky, and people managed, at least for a while, to forget their troubles. Or at least pretend to, which is usually good enough. So settle in. Picture yourself under night sky, the moon hanging overhead, the streets full of lanterns swaying gently in the breeze. The smell of dumplings drifts through the air. Somewhere, a poet is writing about the moon because of course he is. Children are running around with paper lanterns shaped like rabbits, or fish, or dragons, while nervous officials are quietly hoping no one sets the palace roof on fire. Welcome to the Lantern Festival, the ancient world's best excuse to stay up past bedtime. The Lantern Festival traditionally falls on the 15th night of the first lunar month, the end of Chinese New Year celebrations. Which means, it's basically the grand finale of 2 weeks of non-stop feasting, firecrackers, and family arguments. By this point, people had probably already eaten their body weight in sticky rice cakes, so why not finish with a bang? Or rather, with a glow. In the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE 220 CE, the emperor supposedly ordered lanterns to be lit in honor of the Buddha. Over time, this grew into a full-blown festival. By the Tang Dynasty, it was huge. Picture Chang'an, the Tang capital, with markets overflowing, streets jammed with people, and miles of lanterns hung from palaces, temples, and taverns. Think of it as a medieval light show, but without electricity or safety codes. Now, lanterns weren't just practical lights. They were art. Some were simple paper globes. Others were elaborate silk creations shaped like animals, flowers, even palaces themselves. The wealthy competed to make theirs bigger, brighter, more elaborate. If you think competitive Christmas lights are modern, think again. Ancient Chinese elites were already blowing their neighbors out of the water with ridiculous lantern displays centuries ago. Somewhere in the Tang Dynasty, there was definitely one guy muttering, "Oh, Lee next door has a dragon lantern this year? Fine, I'll commission a phoenix that spits sparks." And, of course, there was symbolism. Lanterns lit up the darkness, symbolizing renewal, hope, and guidance. Red lanterns warded off bad luck. Animal-shaped lanterns promised prosperity. Rabbit lanterns? A nod to the moon rabbit pounding medicine up there in the sky. Because yes, Chinese folklore says the moon has a rabbit on it. Don't argue. Just roll with it. The emperors loved the festival, though it gave their ministers headaches. During the Tang Dynasty, the streets of Chang'an stayed lit for 3 nights straight. Markets stayed open. Curfews were lifted. Which meant, yes, people actually went out after dark. This was rare. Normally, city gates closed at night, and being out was suspicious at best, criminal at worst. But on Lantern Festival nights, the rules relaxed. Ordinary citizens mingled freely, enjoying food stalls, puppet shows, riddles, and occasionally drunken poetry contests. The elite joined in too, though with a little more caution. Palaces held their own lantern displays, with courtyards transformed into glowing forests of light. Imagine silk lanterns towering like trees, reflecting in pools, swaying gently as the emperor wandered past, pretending not to notice that half the designs were just flattering poems about him. Honestly, if you were a courtier, you'd slap the emperor's name on your lantern in a heartbeat. Subtlety was not required. But behind the pretty lights were the same human stories as always. Young men and women used the Lantern Festival as a rare excuse to mingle. Think of it as ancient speed dating with paper lights. Normally, respectable girls didn't wander the streets at night. But during the festival, whole families went out. Which meant young people could sneak glances, maybe even exchange a few words, all under the convenient cover of looking at lanterns. Countless poems hint at secret trysts in the glow of festival nights. And probably more than a few awkward moments, too. "Oh, sorry, I thought you were someone else. Nice lantern though." And because no ancient festival is complete without bureaucrats ruining the fun, the authorities sometimes worried the whole thing was getting out of hand. Crowds meant crime. Lanterns meant fire hazards. And there's always the risk of some ambitious nobleman using a festival as cover for plotting. But emperors liked showing off, so the lights stayed on. Ministers sighed. Fire brigades probably stood by nervously with buckets. And the people enjoyed themselves anyway. The Lantern Festival wasn't just about looking. It was about eating too, obviously. Traditional foods included yuan xiao or tang yuan, sweet glutinous rice dumplings filled with sesame paste, red bean, or peanuts. They're round, white, floating in bowls of warm soup, like tiny glowing moons you can eat. Which is perfect, because the festival was tied to the full moon. Also, who doesn't want dessert as symbolism? Other snacks filled the streets too: candied fruits, fried dough, skewered meats. Street vendors made a killing. Imagine bustling alleys lined with stalls, lantern light bouncing off trays of sticky sweets, while kids tugged at their parents' sleeves begging for just one more dumpling. Honestly, it sounds like the coziest kind of chaos. Of course, no ancient festival would be complete without poetry. The Tang Dynasty in particular was obsessed with it. Poets wrote endlessly about lantern nights, comparing glowing lights to stars, moons, or occasionally to their own deep feelings about love and exile. Because poets never miss an opportunity to overshare. One famous poet, Zhong Jiuling, wrote that the festival lights outshone the stars. Which was probably true, if you squinted hard enough and ignored the fire hazard. And then there were the lantern riddles. A beloved pastime. Riddles were written on slips of paper and attached to lanterns. Festival goers tried to guess the answers, often with varying levels of success. Some riddles were clever. Others were groan-worthy dad jokes disguised as puzzles. You can almost imagine a Tang Dynasty dad elbowing his kid and saying, "Get it? Get it?" while the child rolled their eyes and pretended to be fascinated by the dragon lantern instead. Some things never change. So that was the Lantern Festival at its peak. Lights everywhere, food stalls bustling, poets swooning, young lovers sneaking glances, and bureaucrats praying no one set the whole city on fire. For a few nights each year, darkness was banished. People came together, bathed in light, warmed by food and company, lulled by the rhythm of glowing lanterns swaying in the breeze. And if you're starting to feel drowsy now, that's perfect. Because this festival was never about fireworks or chaos. It was about steady light in the night, calm in the crowd, a reminder that even in the darkest seasons, people could come together and glow a little. So, we've had the Tang with their rotating lantern towers, the Song with their mechanical dragon lanterns, and ministers everywhere quietly panicking about fire hazards. You'd think later dynasties would tone it down. Of course they didn't. This is China we're talking about, where the unofficial motto might as well have been, go bigger or go home. Enter the Yuan Dynasty, 1271 to 1368, run by the Mongols. Yes, the same Mongols who conquered half the planet, built the largest land empire in history, and generally terrified everyone from Hungary to Korea. But when they weren't busy rampaging across continents, they too liked a good festival. The Mongol rulers adopted Chinese traditions, including the Lantern Festival. And because Mongols were used to proving themselves with giant displays of power, horses, armies, pyramids of skulls, the usual, they leaned hard into making the festival spectacular. Records describe enormous lantern displays in Dardu, modern Beijing, with towers strung in colored silk, fireworks crackling, and music filling the streets. Yes, fireworks had arrived by this point, which meant the festival could now combine massive flammable lantern towers with explosives. What could possibly go wrong? The Yuan emperors loved putting themselves at the center of it all. Imagine a Mongol Khan-turned Chinese emperor sitting in his palace, watching thousands of glowing lanterns float upward, while fireworks exploded above. It must have felt like conquering the night sky itself. Which was probably the point. Nothing says, I own this place now, like lighting up the heavens. Then came the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, who took the Lantern Festival and basically said, okay, but what if we made it ridiculous? Ming emperors adored turning the festival into imperial theater. Huge palace displays lasted days, even weeks. Entire teams of artisans spent months designing lanterns that were less pretty paper lights and more massive stage productions. One Ming emperor, reportedly, ordered a lantern tower so tall that it rivaled city walls, draped in silk, covered with thousands of oil lamps, and decorated with moving figures. Imagine a glowing skyscraper, except entirely made of wood and fire. Ministers begged him not to light it. He lit it anyway. Because of course he did. Apparently, the tower shone so brightly it lit up the whole capital. Which sounds impressive, until you remember that a single gust of wind could have turned the whole thing into a barbecue. By the Ming period, lanterns had also gotten creative. Artisans made lanterns shaped like everything: birds, pagodas, dragons, palaces, mythological creatures, even historical heroes. Some were designed to move, powered by clever little mechanisms. Picture a lantern shaped like a carp that wriggled as though swimming, or a dragon that actually flew in circles overhead. Honestly, the Ming were building animatronics centuries before Disneyland. And of course, the emperors used it all as propaganda. Every lantern wasn't just pretty, it was symbolic. Dragons symbolized imperial power. Phoenixes symbolized prosperity. Lotus flowers symbolized purity. Put them all together in glowing silk and oil lamps, and the emperor was basically saying, look, the cosmos itself approves of me. Please ignore the fact that my court is a disaster. But the festival wasn't just for emperors. Ordinary people in the Ming Dynasty also threw themselves into it. Streets were lined with stalls selling snacks, cheap lanterns, and questionable wine. Families wandered the night markets, gawking at giant lantern towers while kids begged for little rabbit-shaped lanterns of their own. It was one of the rare times when the rigid hierarchy of Ming society blurred, at least for a night. Everyone could enjoy the lights. Everyone could eat dumplings. Everyone could look up at the same full moon and pretend things weren't quite so hard. Still, the Ming couldn't resist adding a little absurdity. Take the emperor's inner court. The palace women had their own private lantern displays, with intricate designs meant to impress the emperor if he wandered by. Some sources suggest the displays even turned into competitions, each concubine trying to outshine the others with her personal lantern. Because why settle for ordinary palace drama when you can mix in competitive arts and crafts? And then there's the endless paranoia. Ming emperors were famously suspicious, sometimes refusing to mingle with crowds at all. Instead, they'd watch the festival from secure pavilions, surrounded by guards, while their subjects swirled through the glowing streets below. Imagine the contrast, the people celebrating in a blaze of light, while the emperor peeked nervously from behind silk curtains, wondering which minister was plotting against him this week. Truly festive. The Ming also perfected the art of lantern riddles. By now, they'd become a central part of the festival. Temples, taverns, and palaces all hung lanterns with riddles attached, daring passers-by to guess the answers. Some were clever. Some were puns. Others were basically medieval dad jokes. The tradition stuck so strongly that solving lantern riddles is still part of the Lantern Festival today. It's comforting to know that across 6 centuries, humans have never tired of groaning at bad wordplay. The festivals could also get rowdy. Fireworks, while beautiful, had a habit of misfiring. Lantern towers collapsed. Crowds got out of hand. More than one Ming emperor scolded his officials for letting things get too chaotic. But no one ever suggested cancelling the festival. The glow was too important. It wasn't just entertainment, it was identity. To cancel the Lantern Festival would have been like cancelling the moon itself. So, in the Yuan and Ming dynasties, the Lantern Festival reached its height. Lantern towers scraping the sky, fireworks booming overhead, emperors glowing in their own reflected light, and ordinary people lost in the wonder of it all. And yet, beneath the glow, the usual irony remained. The Mongols fell. The Ming fell. The emperors who built giant towers of light ended up forgotten, their legacies reduced to footnotes about how impressive their flammable decorations were. But the lanterns, the festival itself, endured. The emperors are dust. The lights are still burning. So tonight, as we wander through the Ming capital in our minds, picture it. Towering lantern towers glowing against the night sky, dragons twisting overhead, phoenixes shimmering in silk, fireworks bursting, crowds gasping. Somewhere in the palace, the emperor sips wine, half proud, half paranoid. And all across the city, ordinary families laugh, eat dumplings, and carry their little paper rabbits, oblivious to dynasties rising and falling above them. The lights blaze, the people glow, and the night is alive. By the time the Qing dynasty took over in the 17th century, the Lantern Festival was already 1,000 years old. Think about that for a second. Emperors had risen and fallen, Mongols had ridden in and out, the Ming had burned themselves out in a blaze of paranoia, and through it all, people still lit their paper rabbits every spring. Dynasties may not last forever, but apparently dumplings and lanterns do. The Qing emperors, being Manchu outsiders ruling a Chinese majority, were always balancing between tradition and control. On one hand, they wanted to show respect for Chinese customs to keep their subjects happy. On the other hand, they also wanted to make sure no one used big festivals as an excuse for rebellion. Which, let's be honest, was a reasonable fear when you're an invading dynasty ruling hundreds of millions of people. So the Lantern Festival under the Qing became a kind of safe middle ground. The emperors allowed grand palace displays, but kept them tightly controlled. Beijing's Forbidden City held its own glowing spectacles, with courtyards strung with silk lanterns, towers lit up, and carefully choreographed performances. Everything was dazzling, but also orderly, exactly the way Qing emperors liked it. The Kangxi Emperor, reigned 1661 to 1722, was particularly fond of festivals. He used them as opportunities to show off imperial benevolence. "Look at me," he was basically saying, "sharing joy with my people. Please ignore the fact that I'm consolidating absolute power while doing it." During his reign, palace lantern displays were meticulously planned, combining traditional designs with new Manchu flair. The Qianlong Emperor, his grandson, took it further. Qianlong was obsessed with spectacle. He adored commissioning giant projects, temples, palaces, poems, lots of poems. Naturally, his lantern festivals were just as grand. Accounts describe entire palace courtyards transformed into seas of glowing silk, lanterns shaped like mountains, pagodas, even mythological creatures. He loved symbolism. so you can bet there were dragons in abundance. Dragons everywhere. If you weren't sure Qianlong was the son of heaven, just look at his lantern collection. Subtlety was not in his vocabulary. But outside the palace, the Lantern Festival was still a people's holiday. In Beijing, Suzhou, Guangzhou, really any major city, the streets came alive. Markets sold cheap lanterns to families. Kids ran around with animal-shaped designs. Couples slipped away from their parents to admire glowing ponds together. Fireworks cracked overhead, despite endless official bans on using them too close to the palace walls. Because, yes, even in the Qing, officials were still nervously muttering, "Fire hazard, people, fire hazard." Ordinary families saw the festival as a kind of magical reset. Winter was ending. Spring was coming. The full moon shone overhead, round and bright, symbolizing reunion and harmony. Families ate tangyuan dumplings together, little sweet balls that stuck in your teeth but also symbolized unity. It wasn't just dessert. It was destiny in sesame paste form. And yet, the Qing couldn't escape their own irony. The emperors used the Lantern Festival as propaganda, but the sheer joy of the people was something they couldn't control. Crowds gathered. Songs were sung. Poems circulated. Gossip spread. Beneath the glow of the lanterns, people whispered about politics, taxes, and grievances. Because that's what humans do, we can enjoy the lights and complain about the government at the same time. The Qing also saw the festival take on new artistic flourishes. By the 18th and 19th centuries, lantern artisans had refined their craft into something extraordinary. Lanterns were painted with landscapes, calligraphy, and delicate scenes of daily life. Some were designed to move, spinning like miniature worlds. Others used clever tricks with mirrors and candles to project shifting images onto walls. Imagine a child in 1800 staring wide-eyed at a lantern that moved like a magic shadow show. No tick-tock needed. This was already mesmerizing. Of course, by the late Qing, things got gloomier. The dynasty was collapsing under pressure. Foreign invasions, internal rebellions, endless corruption. The Taiping Rebellion alone killed millions. Against that backdrop, the Lantern Festival must have felt bittersweet. The lights still glowed, but they were fragile, flickering against the storm. You can picture a family in a ruined city, still lighting a paper lantern, still eating their dumplings, because tradition was all they had left. And yet, the festival endured. Even when Beijing burned during the Second Opium War. Even when the Qing finally collapsed in 1911. Even when warlords, civil wars, and revolutions swept across the 20th century. Somehow, every spring, lanterns still rose. That's the strange resilience of it. Emperors tried to make the festival about themselves. Ministers tried to control it. Rebels tried to exploit it. Foreigners tried to ban it. Dynasties fell, palaces crumbled, towers burned. But the Lantern Festival just kept going, like the moon it celebrated, sometimes dimmed, sometimes hidden, but always coming back. So tonight, as we drift through a Qing dynasty lantern night, imagine the scene. The Forbidden City glowing with carefully arranged silk lanterns, dragons and phoenixes shining in imperial colors. Outside the palace, Beijing streets buzzing with food stalls and fireworks. Children carrying paper rabbits. Parents laughing. Poets sighing into their wine. Soldiers keeping uneasy watch. The emperors wanted order. The people wanted joy. And the lanterns lit it all the same. By the end of the Qing dynasty, the Lantern Festival had already been around for over a millennium. Which is impressive, but also a little awkward, because the empire that had carried it for centuries was falling apart. The 19th century saw foreign invasions, rebellions, and humiliating treaties pile up like bad debt. The dynasty collapsed in 1911, the last Emperor Puyi was kicked out of the Forbidden City a few years later, and suddenly China had to figure out how to be a republic. So what happened to the Lantern Festival in all that chaos? Well, it kept going, but it stumbled. The early Republic of China, 1912 to 1949, was chaotic at best, nightmarish at worst. Warlords carved up the country. Governments rose and fell. Japan invaded. Civil war simmered. In all that, you'd think people would give up on paper rabbits and dumplings. But no. Festivals are stubborn things. In cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing, families still lit lanterns when they could. Markets still sold Tang Yuan. Children still carried animal-shaped lights through alleys, even if the adults around them were busy dodging politics and bullets. Of course, there were attempts to modernize it. Some reformers thought the festival was too backward, too feudal, too distracting from the pressing business of building a modern nation. Others wanted to reinvent it as a more civic holiday, stripped of superstition. But ordinary people mostly ignored the debates. If you've ever seen a kid holding a glowing paper rabbit, you know it takes more than a political pamphlet to kill that joy. Then came the People's Republic of China, founded in 1949. The communist government initially wasn't too keen on traditional festivals. The Lantern Festival, like many old customs, was branded as superstitious. For a time, especially during the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, festivals were downplayed or outright discouraged. Red lanterns were fine, political lanterns were fine, but paper rabbits, riddles, and sugary dumplings weren't exactly revolutionary priorities. But here's the thing, people celebrated anyway. Quietly, at home, in small ways. A few dumplings here. A paper lantern there. Traditions don't disappear just because a government memo says so. They flicker in the background, waiting. And after the Cultural Revolution ended, the festival returned. Slowly at first, then more openly. By the 1980s and 1990s, Lantern Festival celebrations were back in force across China, often bigger than before. Meanwhile, outside mainland China, the festival thrived uninterrupted. In Taiwan, Hong Kong, and overseas Chinese communities, lantern festivals lit up parks, temples, and streets every spring. Taiwan in particular made it into a national event. Cities like Taipei and Taichung hosted giant displays with lanterns the size of houses, glowing floats shaped like dragons, tigers, or the zodiac animal of the year. If the Ming emperors could have seen it, they'd probably have nodded approvingly and said, "Yes, good. Needs more dragons." And in the 20th century, technology joined in. Electric lights replaced candles in many lanterns, making them safer and longer lasting. Entire lantern parks popped up, filled with glowing installations that drew crowds by the thousands. Fireworks shows grew bigger, flashier, louder. Some people grumbled that the festival had become too commercialized, too artificial. But then again, people have probably been complaining about that since the Tang Dynasty. In my day, lanterns were made of real silk, not this cheap paper nonsense. Even with modernization, the heart of the festival remained. Families gathering, eating Tang Yuan, lighting lanterns, strolling under the moon. The symbolism endured. Lanterns still meant hope, guidance, renewal. The full moon still meant reunion. The sweetness of the dumplings still meant harmony, even if it also meant sticky teeth. There's something soothing in that continuity. Think about it, emperors rose, fell, and died in paranoid splendor. Warlords fought. Foreign armies invaded. Revolutions swept the land. And through it all, people kept lighting little paper lights every spring. Some years the glow was small, hidden, almost forgotten. Other years it blazed bright, filling entire cities. But it never went out completely. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Lantern Festival had become not just a tradition, but a showcase. Cities competed for the biggest displays. Tourist boards promoted them as must-see attractions. Parks hosted elaborate installations with LED lights, glowing tunnels, animated lantern creatures, even 3D projection shows. It's spectacle on a scale the Tang or Ming could only dream of. And yet, at the same time, families still light their little red lanterns at home. Children still carry animal-shaped lights through the streets. The old and the new coexist, glowing side by side. And that's the strange poetry of it. The Lantern Festival has always been two things at once: imperial propaganda and people's joy, elite spectacle and homely tradition, dazzling towers of light and tiny paper rabbits. The dynasties are gone, but the festival endures, sometimes humble, sometimes overblown, always glowing. So tonight, as we drift into the 20th century streets of Beijing or Taipei, picture it: neon signs blinking above, but below them, families still carrying their little lanterns. Children laughing, dumplings steaming in bowls, fireworks crackling overhead. The emperors are long gone. The ideologies rose and fell. But the light is still here. So here we are, 2,000 years after the first lanterns flickered to life. The emperors are gone. The dynasties are dust. The palaces that once blazed with silk and flame are museums, or ruins, or tourist attractions with gift shops selling lead bunny lights. And yet, every spring, the Lantern Festival still returns. It's quieter now in some places, louder in others. In Beijing, grand official displays line up in public parks. In Taiwan, giant glowing sculptures fill entire fields. In smaller towns, families still hang red lanterns at their doors, eat sticky dumplings, and step outside to admire the moon. In Chinatowns across the world, San Francisco, London, Sydney, lanterns string across streets, glowing red against the night, marking the end of Lunar New Year. The settings have changed, but the feeling hasn't. And what is that feeling, exactly? Lanterns are simple things. Paper, silk, maybe bamboo, maybe LED lights these days. They don't roar or flash like fireworks. They don't overwhelm. They just glow. Softly, steadily. Enough to hold the darkness at bay. Enough to make the night feel friendly, not endless. That's the heart of the festival, finding comfort in light, in company, in repetition. The dumplings might stick in your teeth, the riddles might be bad puns, the fireworks might be too loud, but the lanterns are always the same. They glow, they sway, they make the night gentle. In a way, the Lantern Festival has always been a contradiction. Emperors once used it as propaganda, building absurd towers of flame to prove their divine glory. Ministers tried to control it, moralists complained about it, artisans turned it into competitions of skill. And yet, beneath all that, ordinary people just wanted a night to wander, to laugh, to eat something sweet, to feel the glow. The emperors are forgotten. Their lantern towers burned down centuries ago. But the ordinary joy outlasted them. That's the festival's real legacy, not the giant palace displays, but the little paper rabbit lantern in a child's hand. The glow that keeps coming back, year after year. And maybe that's why the Lantern Festival feels so timeless. It's not just a holiday. It's a rhythm. Winter ends, the moon swells, the lanterns rise. Empires fall, ideologies crumble, cities change, but the lights return. Always. It's comforting to think about. Somewhere right now, someone is carrying a lantern through a street. Somewhere a family is eating tang yuan, laughing at a joke they've told 100 times. Somewhere a poet is writing another poem about the moon, because poets never change. And somewhere a child is staring at a glowing rabbit lantern like it's the most magical thing in the world.